Fantastic. Thank you so much, Laura, for that warm welcome. Hello, everyone. We're so excited to dive deep into this conversation today. And thank you, Laura, for sharing or encouraging everyone to reach out to their services afterwards. We will be talking about services available after this, but very happy to give any guidance after today's session as well. So as Laura just said, we will be talking about human rights in the digital world today for International Women's Day. And Laura's already done fantastic acknowledgement of country, so we can quickly move forward here and give you a bit of introduction about who we are. So Voices of Influence Australia is a youth-led organisation that really functions to move the masses who are passive individual consciences into being active collective voices for human rights. And we focus really on the protection, promotion and attainment of human rights here in Australia and globally. And as Laura introduced you, I joined here today by myself, and my name's Alice. I'm the founder of Voices of Influence Australia, but we're also joined here by Taylor, who's our Legal and Political Affairs Director, as well as Zoe, who's our Human Trafficking and Modern Slavery Chair, which is brilliant. As Laura said, you guys have probably had the opportunity to read through the brochure before, so I've learned a little bit more about us. But to give a quick synopsis, my background is in social work and now international law, but my whole calling is towards the protection and promotion of human rights. And this particular area about human rights online is a growing interest as well, particularly as the digital world is rapidly expanding and growing, and the conversation of human rights rightfully has to grow and expand with that in order to keep everyone safe and to support the human dignity of each and everyone. But I'll pass over to Taylor to give a quick introduction to herself as well.
Hi everyone, my name's Taylor. I graduated with a Bachelor of Laws at the end of 2020. I currently work as a very soon to be, as of Friday, commercial lawyer at a national commercial law firm. And yeah, I'm actively involved in influencing and sustaining the wider legal profession. So I sit on the Executive Council for New South Wales Young Lawyers, and I'm also on the board of Women Illawarra, which is a organisation for women in the Illawarra providing violence advocacy and services. So yeah, to Zoe.
Sorry, just playing up a bit there. Well, yeah, I'm Zoe. I'm the Human Trafficking Modern Slavery Chair. I guess I kind of fell into this sort of area because I kind of got involved a bit early on with a human trafficking organization called A21, and kind of just fell in love with that and sort of have been involved in the area for quite a few years now. Yeah, I guess my sort of educational background is I graduated with a double degree in justice, focusing criminology and psychology back in 2019, if I remember correctly. It's been a while. And then I went on and did my honours in justice, which I focus around sort of far right extremism in online spaces, and as well as rural politicians and sort of normalising that. And right now I'm a public servant with the Queensland government.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for those very brief introductions. But like I said, I'm sure you all saw the brochures and were able to read a bit more. So to give you a bit of an idea of how we're going to be running today. So Taylor's going to be going over what our legal rights are online, which is very, again, in probably the most succinct and fantastic way. And then Taylor and I will be going over what gender-based violence looks like online, both in the online space as we know it, and in the evolving space of the metaverse as I understand it as well. And then Zoe will be talking about social media and far-right extremism. And then we'll bounce back to me to talk about how you all can continue the conversation in community activism, and how you can take what you learned today into the community to kind of mobilize other people as well. And as we said before, we would then be talking about support services available if you have experienced any kind of discrimination, violence, gender-based violence or harm online. But to begin with, we'll jump, oh, so sorry about that, into Taylor, go for it.
Okay, so as we know, the internet provides unparalleled opportunities for the promotion and the advancement of certain rights, most centrally the right to seek, receive and impart information. However, it also provides a medium through which people can and definitely do publish hateful, discriminatory comments and intimidate and harass others in a manner which really undermines the human rights of those who are targeted. So if we jump to the next slide, that is why we have a range of legal instruments to safeguard our rights. So there are a range of international instruments as well as domestic laws that highlight your human rights in online spaces. They mainly cover the freedom of expression and internet censorship, the right to access the internet, and then effective responses to racism, sexism, sexual harassment, and homophobia and the like on the internet. So in Australia, as we know, it's unlawful to discriminate on the basis of a number of protected attributes, including age, disability, race, sex, intersex status, gender identity, sexual orientation, in most areas of life, including education and employment. So there are a range of federal and state/territory acts, such as the Racial Discrimination Act, which is Commonwealth legislation, Sex Discrimination Act, again, Commonwealth legislation, and the Anti-Discrimination Act, which we have in New South Wales, to protect people's rights in this way. So, for example, if someone is cybersexual harassed at work by a colleague who is using a work computer or a work mobile phone, that situation is covered by the Sex Discrimination Act. So knowing our rights with respect to things like this is more important now more than ever before, given that the remote workplace and flexible working policies have sort of become our new normal. And the casual nature of virtual and online communication sort of blurs professional boundaries and can quite easily become a breeding ground for inappropriate behaviour. So harassment is harassment, and companies should ensure that they have robust policies in place and are prepared to deal with / mitigate these types of working from home risks, because they're very real. If we go to the next slide, very recently, in January of this year, the Online Safety Act came into effect, providing the eSafety Commissioner with even stronger powers to keep Australians safe online. So the Act brings some pretty big changes, including a world-first cyber abuse takedown scheme to protect adults. The scheme allows the eSafety Commissioner to order the removal of seriously harmful online abuse when websites, social media, or other online services fail to remove this content following user complaints. The Act strengthens the existing cyberbullying scheme to protect children. So it enables the removal of cyberbullying material from the full range of online services where children are now spending time. So it's not just social media platforms anymore, but this includes games, websites, messaging services, and things like that. And then the Act also gives the eSafety Commissioner stronger information gathering and investigative powers to obtain the identities behind anonymous online accounts that are used to bully, abuse, or exchange illegal content, which is a really, really important power, because as we know, often when you are receiving any kind of harassment or abuse online, and you'll find that if you contact law enforcement, they'll often tell you to block them. But obviously that doesn't undo any harm done or anything that you might have experienced throughout. So, and retribution in that aspect is nearly impossible because you don't know who they are. So a big welcome change. So the Act forms part of Australia's broader, world-leading push to regulate big tech in the online environment. It really progresses this general trend toward increased regulation in the space and will likely prompt the international community to consider similar reforms. So definitely watch this space because it is quite a big one. If we jump to the next slide. So let's sort of take a step back and look at the bigger picture of, the internet users and gender-based violence in online spaces. So according to the latest facts and figures from the International Telecommunication Union, an estimated 4.9 billion people are using the internet as of 2021. That means that roughly 63% of the world's population is now online, which is an increase of 17% since 2019, which is massive. And internet penetration has increased more than 20% on average in Africa and in Asia and the Pacific. So unfortunately, the rapid expansion of online spaces has seen the same patterns of discrimination, oppression, and power that dominate offline spaces reproduced, and if not intensified, online. So on the next slide, you'll see that gender-based violence can take many different forms and can be very pervasive. In 2020, the humanitarian organisation Plan International carried out surveys based on online experiences from around the world, hearing from 14,000 girls and young women from across 31 countries. This is the largest ever survey of its type. In all 22 countries, girls had been exposed to explicit messages, pornographic photos, cyber stalking, and other distressing forms of abuse. Most commonly, girls were targeted with abusive and insulting language, reported by more than half, so 59% of the girls, followed by deliberate embarrassment, which was 41%, and body shaming and threats of sexual violence, both 39%. So online violence is also employed at much higher rates to target those who don't conform to social norms, particularly social norms of femininity or heteronormativity. The LGBTIQA2+ users are significantly more likely to experience online violence linked to their gender expression and sexuality. So the experiences of women, of LGBTIQA+ users, and people of colour are pretty frequently dismissed as less important than the struggles faced by their peers, and members of these groups are often labelled as disruptive when they expose the discrimination that they suffer. So for some members of these groups, online communities obviously provide really vital safe spaces from offline worlds, places where they can explore their identity, connect with like-minded people, and reach their support networks. And so in this context, speaking out against online violence and paying attention to these discriminatory patterns is a really important political act of solidarity. On the next slide, this is so much fun. So to put things into perspective from a domestic point of view, according to the 2019 eSafety Women report, in Australia, 30% of women have experienced online abuse or harassment. 40% and 47% of women who had experienced online abuse were aged 18 to 24. And 37% of women who had experienced online abuse or harassment said that on at least one occasion, these online experiences made them feel that their physical safety was threatened. So the situation, as is all of gender-based violence, is pretty dire, particularly in Australia as well. So it's really important that we are aware of the safeguards in place, the support services in place, and what our rights actually are legally, because they're there. And yeah, just pay attention to these sorts of issues, and particularly the nuances, because there are definitely marginalised groups that suffer at much higher rates. And that is it from me for the moment.
Fabulous. All right, well, that's jumping back to me. Thank you, Taylor, for giving us a very succinct explanation about what our rights are online. I will be doing a bit of an explanation, or an exploration, I should probably say, about what gender-based violence looks like in the metaverse, and this increasingly and rapidly expanding understanding of what we know as online rights. And I'll kind of be talking about this in like mainly three different areas. So really, what does like racial discrimination look like online in the metaverse? How can we take a bit of a feminist analysis on it? And also, what does democratic accountability look like in the metaverse when we're looking at gender-based violence and other threats to women and non-binary people online? So jumping forward, so we'll first look at excuse me. We'll first look at racial discrimination in the metaverse. So kind of if we take a step forward and look ahead about what we're about to really experience in our online space. So it's important to carefully consider the values that are being encoded in the next generation of the internet. So what are really the foundations there? And it's important. This is important because this is really going to set the tone for how this grows and evolves very quickly in the quite short-term future. But a thing that we really have to recognize is that the racist and sexist harassment is cropping up in today's pre-metaverse immersive environments. There's already countless cases of sexual harassment, of groping, of rape within the virtual reality world, and there's very little accountability for it, and there's very little justice for it as well. So it's important we start having these conversations in order to kind of allow human rights, what we understand about human rights, to grow and expand with it. But basically, this is ensuring that this next iteration of the internet is inclusive and works for everyone, and will require that people, but it also require that people that are marginalized or from marginalized communities take lead in shaping it. Are they getting that representation? Are they being consulted with? Do they have a voice at the table in terms of how we understand those values, or these foundations for what we understand about the metaverse? And women are absolutely included in those marginalized groups. But it will also require, as what Taylor was just speaking about before, it will require regulation with teeth, and strong teeth at that, to keep big tech accountable to the public interest, and particularly the interest of women and non-binary communities as well. And I think so the next kind of conversation we have to have when looking at racial discrimination is, I think, those who perhaps aren't so well versed in this conversation or haven't done a deep dive research into it, I have this very utopian view on what virtual reality is going to be, or what the metaverse is. And the reality is it's quite a scary future, and there are a lot of tech activists and a lot of women activists that are quite scared about what this is going to mean in terms of the safety of women, and the human dignity of women and non-binary communities as well. So as I just saying, people have envisioned the internet as a way to escape parts of their identity, such as race, gender, and class. But in reality, we know that the internet is far from raceless, and it's far from being completely classless and genderless. Like, these are things that are absolutely very apparent and are very real, even in the internet and in virtual reality. And the metaverse is likely to have widespread consequences that transform how we socialize, how we work, how we play, how we develop, how we communicate. This is something we already know. But a question that we have to keep asking ourselves as this evolves and it's a question that we've had through the whole of our development as a human species and our anthropology, is, will those consequences be the same for everyone? And what we've learned from history is that it is an absolute no, it's not going to infect everyone equally. And that's something that we have to take into account. And so that kind of moves us on into having a bit of a feminist analysis of the metaverse and online spaces. So as we were kind of just alluding to before, when we're talking about making the meta safer or making virtual reality safer, we have to first acknowledge that these power asymmetries that we see in day-to-day life do not simply fix themselves just because we put a headset on. Just because we put this machinery on us doesn't mean that completely dismantles the power, the imbalances and the dangers that come with that magically. So in order to make the metaverse safe for women, engineers and those that are in tech must actively set out to design anti-racist and feminist virtual environments that protect the most vulnerable users. And this includes Black women, it includes non-binary women, women that are living with disabilities, those whose English isn't their mother tongue, immigrants, queer people, those who come from lower socioeconomic areas or incomes. These are people that need to have their voices be heard and seen in order to make sure that they are safe in these online spaces. And so in order for the metaverse, as I just said, for the metaverse to be safe for women, Meta and other platforms such as this have to design controls against non-consensual touching and allow avatars to block citizens of the metaverse to seek to do them wrong and deplatform harmful uses. But most importantly, and I think this is a very strong rhetoric that's coming from a lot of tech activists and a lot of women's rights activists in the tech space, is that there needs to be a governing body for this. And as according for MIT Technology Review, currently there is no body that is plainly responsible for the rights and safety of those who participate anywhere online, let alone in the virtual world. And this is a major issue because, as we understand, which I'll go into in a little bit, is where is the democratic accountability in this space when this becomes a much stronger part of or a much bigger part of our world? Where is justice and where is accountability going to be found? Obviously, as Taylor just went through, we've had a few milestones in terms of legislation that's there to protect us and support us, but there needs to be stronger bodies governing this in order to have, as we said before, put that teeth into the accountability of big tech organizations.
Just to interject before Alice continues,
yes.
That's exactly right. And I think we're also yet to see how effective the legislation is and whether the service providers that it targets are actually going to be held accountable and responsible for what happens on their platforms, on their apps. So definitely, I think it's encouraging, and we should see it as hopeful that we have law and policy that's responding to statistics and issues around us, but we're still yet to see if it's effective. So.
Yeah, Taylor, and I think that sort of helps to potentially answer Cynthia's question about how to protect children on apps and games that they use as well, unless you had something further to add.
No, that's right. It's, I think, with the new powers given to the eSafety Commissioner and the way that service providers and apps are regulated here, hopefully we're going to see some of that teeth. But it's, and this is the problem, right? So much of it falls on the user, and it's how, you know, I guess you as a parent, for instance, of a child, how you put certain things in place, such as, you know, monitoring them or making sure that there's sufficient like parental blocks and things like that. And a lot of the burden falls on you, but yet still that's not 100% effective either, and things can still happen. So, and we also don't want to be coming in too late, because, you know, it's one thing to sort of punish someone or something after it's happened, but the damage has been done, and in some cases real abuse has occurred and people have suffered harm. And how do you go back to that? Like, we want to be preventing these things, but hopefully as well, I think the legislation will definitely act as a deterrent. And it is sort of, you know, big tech don't want to pay more money than they need to. So I think that it's sort of that that push to make sure that they have policies in place and sort of risk matrix in place and things there, so that they don't end up being culpable for anything that happens.
Fantastic. Thank you for jumping in, Taylor. It's important questions to ask, and I'm glad that Taylor was equipped with the right information to be able to answer it properly. But it does kind of seem into the next thing, which is looking at a democratic, accountable metaverse. So interestingly, in an interview done by Audie Cornish, by one of the vice presidents of Metaverse, he basically asked, if you can't handle the comments on Instagram, how can you handle the t-shirt that has hate speech on it in the universe? How can you handle the hate rally that might happen in the universe, which is really talking about that intersection between the reality and the metaverse itself. But I guess something that a reflection that I had from this was, in a similar sense, like, if women are punished for speaking out about sexism and gender-based violence online already, then how can they do so in the metaverse with that assurance that they're going to be safe and they're going to have their rights protected online? So ensuring that the metaverse is inclusive and promotes democratic values rather than threatens democracy requires design justice and social media and regulation, but also metaverse regulation as well. And for those of you that aren't so familiar with this concept of design justice, but design justice is putting people who do not hold the power in society at the center of the design process to avoid perpetuating existing inequalities and existing threats to human rights to a lot of communities online. And finally, looking at that accountability, it's about talking about how do we protect our women online. So as we kind of spoken about today, so federal laws have in the past shielded social media companies from the liability of users' posts and actions from their platforms, and this also applies to the metaverse as well. And this means that they have the right but not the responsibility to release their sites. And so by regulating big tech, it's a really crucial step for confronting the problems on social media as well as the metaverse, and going and as the internet expands consistently for the next generation and for the safety of children and the safety of women and marginalized communities as well. So obviously the metaverse is a big topic, particularly from a human rights perspective. I think it creates a lot of anxiety about how to be kind of equip ourselves appropriately to look after the people and protect the people that we care about, and particularly marginalized communities. And it's a conversation that will continue to evolve as the internet evolves as well, and as tech evolves. But that's it for me for now. I'm going to pass over to Zoe to talk a bit more about social media as a tool for radicalization.
Hello. Okay, so this is going to be a bit heavy, but so I'm going to be looking at sort of far right extremism and in online spaces, especially with social media. I think before we sort of jump into that, it's really important to acknowledge that sort of the far right extremism space and far right extremism as a political and social group is kind of ironically quite diverse and quite heterogeneous, and which makes it difficult to have a sort of singular definition about what is and isn't far right extremism. However, across the sort of many political and social groups that we can see that fall under this sort of umbrella, you can see some common themes that are included, but not, I guess, limited to sort of a strong sense of nationalism, anti-multiculturalism, anti-government, anti-democratic, well, anti-elite sort of views. And these sort of themes, or I guess views, can sort of be on a spectrum with like different sort of far right extremist groups sort of aligning themselves to like different sides. We sort of see more white supremacy sort of far right groups having greater focus on the anti-multiculturalism rhetoric, whereas more recently we've seen the rise of what's called sovereign citizens, who have a bit more of an anti-elite, anti-government, anti-democratic sort of views. However, we're going to be talking about it much more so generally, because it'll be it'll be a much longer talk just even talking about like all the different groups that fall under this umbrella. However, with this sort of definition in mind, you can kind of see how far-right extremism is in sort of direct opposition to human rights. It sort of challenges the sort of themes of it challenges like the sort of themes of equity and fairness that guides many human rights. And so as we've seen sort of rise of far-right extremism over the last couple of years, you kind of see it's associated with a threat to sort of human rights as well. I guess also furthermore, while sort of far-right extremism sort of utilization of social media and the far-right extremism as a movement is certainly not new. It's sort of the way it's using social media and the internet to enable, amplify, and spread its messages is pretty unprecedented. The far-right extremism has utilized social media and the internet in a variety of ways to recruit people, spread their message, and translate these sort of views and rhetoric to direct offline action. And we sort of seen a significant rise over the last couple of years, both with the rise in attacks as well as sort of COVID-19 and associated lockdowns and everything like that, sort of creating this perfect melting pot. So with that in mind, I'm going to be discussing sort of how far-right extremism utilizes social media in three main ways. One is going to be as a tool for radicalization, which I'll be going into soon, as a tool for spreading rhetoric, and as a tool for offline action. So in regards to social media tool being used as a tool for radicalization, while it's important to acknowledge that there's no singular profile for an extremist and there's no sort of singular pathway for like radicalization to a point of extremism or even sort of terrorism, we do know there are sort of common predisposing factors that sort of outlined on the slide. These can include sort of real or perceived personal experiences of victimhood, a threat to one's in-group, a sense of detachment or alienation from mainstream or wider society, an identification with a cause linked to a real or perceived victimized community, a desire for a sense of purpose, a mission, or something similar, as these can generate feelings of belonging and agency or sort of similar feelings that people are looking for. Socialization through family, friends, and associates, and an ideological message that resonates with individual own experiences or pre-existing perceptions. As you can sort of see with these sort of, I guess, factors, it kind of makes it clear how and why social media has been able to fit so neatly in as a tool for radicalization. While not too far from previous methods of indoctrination and far and right as we've seen, social media indicates really quite an eerily convenient tool for radicalization, whether that's been purposely designed like that or not. For example, social media allows groups of people who, whilst geographically separate, to talk with very few limitations, which allows for people to it allows for the socialization with people with similar viewpoints and sometimes extremist viewpoints, as well as a lot of social media platforms also allow for the creation and facilitation of communities, and which essentially allows a very accessible way for people to identify a community that they are part of, sort of embed themselves in it, and sort of identify with a cause, a sense of purpose or mission. This is particularly sort of, I guess, dangerous when it's an extremist community. While, a lot of these people who turn to these groups, they are seeking a sense of sort of purpose. Some of them are going through quite severe personal issues such as social isolation, family breakdown, and you can sort of understand why they want to reach out and find a community. When it becomes, when this community is an extremist community, it sort of really enables this sort of makes it a lot easier than previously before the internet and social media to sort of radicalize and make these sort of feelings and ideas of extremism sort of, I guess, okay in someone's mind. And as you can imagine, with the continued rise and this continually evolving environment around technology, social media, and the internet, it's creating this sort of perfect storm for radicalization. That's something that we kind of need to keep up with before it kind of gets worse. If we move on to the next slide, so we can also see that social media functions as a really good tool for sort of spreading rhetoric around, especially far-right rhetoric. This is sort of enabled through a couple of ways. Firstly, social media allows for essentially real-time reactions to essentially everything, whether that's be at a protest, an event, something a politician has said, or even more recently with the flooding in Southeast Queensland over New South Wales, and I think some of New South Wales now. You don't have to go very far to find sort of conspiracy theories and the similar that have popped around that. And that was, we could see that in real time as it was coming out. Also, as we also see with a lot of social media, especially because they have millions of users, there's huge swaths of content being uploaded constantly. A part of sort of, especially in mainstream social media, what they want to do is they want to keep people on their site. The way they do that is through algorithms or similar mechanisms that essentially is driving content that is sort of will either be viral, they'll think that a lot of people will like, or similar to what you as a user will like. That way you're more likely to spend more time on their website. This sort of has the sort of side effect is that if you are sort of more leaning towards the far right, you are gauging a lot more at sort of, I guess, a set between like sort of extremist content. You're, by virtue of wanting to keep you on the platform, social media will likely show you very similar sort of stuff as a way just to keep you on there. And sometimes even this content, because of just so much that's uploaded all the time, it is hard to catch everything that's being uploaded. It can be directly against community guidelines. It can be unethical or blatantly untrue, but doesn't always stop it from getting into your lap, because it's just impossible to, at this stage, to sort of moderate the massive amount of content that's coming online. And we sort of can see that sometimes this can form a sort of echo chamber sort of effect, that you see content that sort of agrees with your pre-existing views. It doesn't really get challenged, and then sometimes that can kind of lead you further and further down a path of extremism. We can sort of see I guess two main sort of ways that social media are being used. Firstly, we can see sort of mainstream platforms, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, I guess, and similar platforms. Their sort of attraction is that they're huge. There are millions of users on them. And so even if not everyone on there agrees with a lot of the far-right rhetoric, it allows for content to be posted constantly every second that can be spread quite quickly and seen by a lot of people. However, we have seen especially over the last few years, that there's been sort of, as a result of sort of generally far-right attacks, an increase in sort of moderation, banning, and other sort of methods to try to limit the amount of this sort of content that's on these sort of websites, the more mainstream ones, which has then led to, I guess, people sort of abandoning ship there and sort of establishing their sort of own sort of social networking services or similar that sort of facilitate for this content to be posted. The example on the slide is Gab. That's a social networking service. It looks and sort of functions very similar to Twitter, but also allows for a lot of other, I guess, online stuff as well. It has an email service, text messaging, news service, video sharing, and a couple other things as well. We have seen sort of Gab rise in popularity, and usually right after a far-right attack, right after Christchurch shooting, it raised significant popularity. After the attack in the Capitol in the US in early 2021, it had a massive surge as well. We sort of see that it's attracting a lot of extremist users and groups who have been banned from other social media or seeking an alternative platform that has less moderation so they can spread their far-right rhetoric. Gab itself sort of marks itself as a promoting free speech, individual liberty, and a free flow of information. However, we have often seen that this is just been sort of used as a bit of a shield of its user base. We have seen sort of websites like Gab, as well as other online platforms, but I'll focus on Gab, being quite heavily linked to radicalization and playing a direct role in certain attacks. One probably the most prominent examples is that there's a Pittsburgh synagogue shooting in the US, I think it was last year, don't quote me on that. But the person who committed that attack directly posted quite a lot of extremist rhetoric online, also posted about his immediate attempt to cause harm before the shooting and posted his manifesto on Gab. So we can see sort of social media being used in a variety of ways. And as we sort of see mainstream social media platforms sort of crack down on sort of far-right extremists and the content they're posting on there, we're likely going to see an increased sort of migration to these sort of far-right or even just a bit looser social working sites that may allow for these individuals to continue post to their audiences. Finally, we go on to the next slide. I'm going to be going through social media as a tool for offline action. We've seen this in a variety of ways. Far-right extremism has been able to, I guess, for lack of a better word, co-opt current political situations to further their message. We've seen this very recently around sort of the rise of vaccine skepticism, anti-mask and lockdown rhetoric, that sort of anti-vaccine in those sort of areas. And we sort of see far-right extremism co-opting those sort of movements to further their sort of anti-government, anti-democratic sort of rhetoric, as well as pin blames for it on groups that they don't particularly like, usually protesters or immigrants particularly. We've seen a huge rise in anti-Asian sort of hate very recently. We have seen this sort of translated into offline action through large far-right presence at sort of anti-lockdown, mask or COVID-19 sort of protests or similar events. And we've seen a lot of journalists and anti-fascist researchers who've been monitoring these protests both online and on the ground have found they are often that far-right agitators or people sort of more leaning towards that sort of far-right area are often the ones that are leading orchestrating this these sort of protests, so they're usually playing like a significant role. And if I don't know if any of you can sort of remember before sort of COVID, but we found that wasn't that sort of extremist sentiment wasn't super common with that sort of the anti-vax crowd before that point. It's sort of been co-opted over the last couple of years by the far right. We've also seen it translate to other offline action, such as most notably recently was the attack on the US Capitol on January 6, 2021. This was a large-scale attack that was I guess, made possible in terms of the viewpoints and rhetoric that they had because of just the amount of people seeing all this rhetoric online and sort of agreeing with it and everything like that, as well as we know that social media played a pivotal role in planning and orchestrating and coordinating this event. If we didn't have social media, the internet, it probably would not have been to sort of scale it was, just by virtue of just how easy social media makes it to sort of plan and orchestrate these things. Finally, and probably most devastatingly, we've seen social media play a sort of really significant role in a lot of far-right and politically motivated attacks especially over the last few years. Nearly every far-right extremist attack we've seen over the last few years social media has played a role in some sort of way, whether that's we saw with the Christchurch shooter live streaming it on Facebook in real time, as well as using it to post his manifesto, or others they use a lot of time to post their manifestos or radicalization or I guess sort of everything like that. If you look at sort of the far-right attacks over the last couple of years, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone where the internet or social media has not played a role. And I guess to tie this all up, it's been a bit of a Debbie Downer, and I guess that kind of makes it, well, we know all this, we know what far-right extremism plays and social media plays a significant role with one another. So what do we do now? And the answer to that question is it's really complicated. But as you sort of heard earlier, part of it is that we do need to keep social media companies and big tech accountable for what is posted, or at least implement mechanisms to better moderate the sort of content. It was understandable that with millions of users and massive swaths of content being posted every second, it's hard to moderate. It's impossible to moderate by a human, which is why we've seen a lot of moderation through technology or AI. It's quite frankly not enough. We've seen it sit through we've seen a lot of far-right content sit through and be allowed online far longer than it should, as well as we kind of need to, I guess, live with the reality that the sort of possibility of a far-right motivated attack in Australia, it's not really a matter of, I guess, if at this point, it's a matter of when. It's far-right extremism is going to continue to rise. Social media is going to, and the internet is going to continue to play a role. And we need to live with that reality, and we need to be proactive in whatever measures we implement rather than just waiting for something to happen and I guess reacting to it. We know it's going to happen. And quite frankly, the people of Australia kind of deserve that we take steps in place to sort of protect them and try to mitigate it where we can. And I guess that's it from me. I'll be passing back to Alice for sort of how to continue this conversation with community activism.
Thank you, Zoe. It's like you did such a great job. Obviously, that is a very heavy conversation to have. And for those of you that haven't seen it, if you haven't seen The Social Dilemma, it's a documentary on Netflix, and I think it kind of dives a bit deeper into the role social media has and kind of being that polarization of left wing and right wing and the rise of extremism as well. So thank you, Zoe, for tackling that conversation. But yeah, we're back to me, and I'm going to be hopefully installing a little bit of hope in everyone today. I know the conversations we've had both with gender-based violence and far-right extremism are quite heavy conversations, but there is hope, and I think there's a lot, particularly at Voices of Influence Australia, we have a lot of hope that community, massively like stakeholders, and more importantly, have the potential to be really strong leaders in how to create social change. And really that starts with you. So activism starts with you. And I will go into, in the next slide, I'll go into different topics about what does that activism look like. But I thought I'd just kind of paint a bit of a big picture about what that looks like. So this is a bit of an older model, but I feel that it often is very helpful in understanding what community activism is. But there's four main real domains of activism. There's the citizen, the reformer, the rebel, and the change agent. And look, after this conversation, after this presentation, if you leave and you're reflecting on which one that you are, I guarantee that it will change day to day, depending on what the topic is, and depending on what kind of work that you want to do. But the citizen pretty much promotes positive and widely held values like democracy and freedom and justice and nonviolence. They're grounded in the center of society. They're grounded in community and mobilizing community. And they protect against charges of extremism. There's the reformer, and the reformer uses more official channels to make change. They use a variety of means. It could be lobbying, protesting, legal action, elections, that kind of really, which is what you see on your TV and things like that. But they also monitor success to assure enforcement and expand success and guard against backlash, and that's the reformer. There's the rebel, and the rebel again is usually the one that's protesting and says no to the violation of values, uses non-violent disobedience and civil disobedience, and puts problems in the spotlight and really gets the conversation going. And then there's the change agent, and the change agent uses people, or the power of people really, to educate and convince and mobilize and inform and involve and the majority of citizens. So it's really creating this wave of social movement and change. As I just said, it's mass-based, it's grassroots-based and organizing. It employs strategy and tactics for long-term movements, and it promotes alternatives to the paradigms. So what does all that mean? I'm sure that for a lot of you that may be like, Alice, that's great, but that's a whole nother language and I don't know what the hell you're talking about. And that's fine, but I'm going to give you some strategies about what that could actually look like. So where do you begin? And that really begins by you doing a bit of self-reflection and being like, and considering some of the issues that you're passionate about. What is some things that you live and breathe, which get you like sets a fire to your soul, that really get you angry and wanting to create change. And once you are able to kind of simmer down what you're really passionate about, then follow those issues like in the news and on social media. Zoe just spoke about, the kind of risks and threat in social media, but it can also be a really fantastic tool in terms of finding other communities that are going to inform you about issues that you might want to learn about. So go and follow, especially if you're interested in women's safety online or particularly marginalized communities or women of color, go and follow like accounts that promote these issues. Follow Black creators and understand their issues from their voices. And that's something that's really important. And then what you can do is really zero in on what's happening locally. And that can mean in Australia, it can be in Sydney, it can be in your neighborhood, it can be in your industry, in your workplace, in a project that you're working on. Like really zero in on what is the gender lens on this? What is the feminist lens on this? Like or even a human rights lens for things. How can I support this and what can I be doing? And then get vocal. And I know getting vocal, I think that can be quite a challenging or quite intimidating thing to do. And getting vocal doesn't mean going and screaming at politicians or protesting every weekend. It can just mean having a conversation at the kitchen table. And by no means I am no expert at that. I still find that really challenging sometimes to have just a conversation at the kitchen table. But it really starts there. And it's about kind of using that language and engaging people to have the conversations that are important to social change and the safety and dignity of everyone. I think there's, for a long time we had this idea of calling people out for having outdated views or doing the wrong thing. And I think now there's slowly this shift, which is rather than call people out, we should be calling them in. So when maybe it might be a friend or a family member or a boss or someone who doesn't agree with what you believe in, or you don't agree with what they stand for. And rather than calling them out for it, you call them in and have that conversation with them. You can also donate your time and money to a cause you might be interested in. As we said, we have Zoe here who's volunteered to over 40 organizations, which is such a tremendous and incredible feat. By no means do you have to do that, but even if it's just working at a community center or working with children, whatever it might be, donate your time. And if you can't donate your time, see if you're in a position to, then donating money is fantastic as well. For a lot of non-for-profits, money is hard to come by. So any coin counts. Another thing you can do is boycott companies whose practices you disagree with. And this is something we're seeing more and more of. We saw particularly a recent one here in Sydney was during the Sydney Festival, and a lot of artists and a lot of those attending Sydney Festival boycotted it because it was getting funded. It was getting funded by an Israeli company, wasn't it, Taylor? Have I got that wrong?
They were accepting like a $20,000 donation from the apartheid regime in Israel.
Yeah. So that was the thing. You can boycott companies or boycott different initiatives that you don't agree with. Again, support or join nonprofits and lobbying for change. Turn up to protests and become regulars at community events. If you're not so comfortable going to protests, but you can go even if it's talks. And hopefully now that COVID and restrictions are coming down, there'll be more talks like this in person, and that will allow you to kind of build those networks of change makers yourself. Another big one is to use your vote and be informed about your vote as well. Like learn more about your representatives, who you're voting for, what they stand for, how they're going to protect women, how they're going to look after you, what are they doing about uplifting marginalized communities, and use your vote that way. One of my favorite things is this cool idea called a slacktivist, or check off your slacktivist to-do list. And I love the word slacktivism, but it could be signing a petition online, it could be signing your name to something, or writing a letter or an email to an MP. It could be just following other social change pages on Instagram or other social media feeds. The other one is talk to your local representatives, send them an email. They're the ones working for us. They're the ones representing our community. So put them to work. And then I said before, discuss with people you love you know, it starts at the kitchen table. And I think that's, you know, in all the things that we kind of do in community activism, I still think the hardest thing is sometimes having those conversations with your loved ones. You know, no one like other than family knows how to push your buttons, and it can be really hard to have a productive conversation, but it really does start there. And I guarantee, even if you are able to kind of mobilize one other person, you're making tremendous effort and change in the community. So those are some strategies in terms of how you can mobilize the information that you've learned today into your lives and into the community that you want to support and look after. And then finally, I know we've got 5 more minutes, or 7 more minutes, but we'll hopefully have some time for a couple of questions. But I just wanted to bring your attention to some support services. As Laura said before, you know, we are very encouraging. If there's anything that's come up from today that is potentially triggering or makes you emotional or upset, please reach out to your employee assistance programs or talk to a loved one and talk to a friend. But there are services out there which are there to support you. Particularly women who have experienced violence or hate crimes online, or have been threatened online, or have had their safety infringed upon. And eSafety Women has some great services there. Technology Safety Australia also has some services. And if you want some more like immediate support, 1-800-RESPECT, they have a sexual assault line there, which is also focusing on online space as well, and gender-based violence online. There's obviously counselling services for mental health support like Lifeline and Beyond Blue. And then there's WESMAT as well, which is also a service which is there to kind of support women that have been either threatened by violence online or their safety has been threatened online. If they've been experiencing any kind of harassment, those services are there for you. I'm happy if this conversation has been upsetting for anyone, I'm more than happy to kind of help guide you to find a service that's going to be appropriate to make sure that you have the support around you. But other than that, it's been a pleasure speaking to everyone. I'm just going to check the chat if there's any questions. Yes, Kat, like call them in. I know it's not always easy, but it's about having that open conversation, that open dialogue, in order to be able to hear both sides and have that productive conversation as well.